Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you, Amber. Thanks for the invitation and this exciting launch of this exciting new center, Futures Nature. What is the future of nature, both non-human and human nature? That will be a question that we will have historically to deal with in one way or another, whether as a scepter of our fate in a crisis-ridden world, or as subjects who reclaim the world and make it a habitable, hospitable, and nice place. Okay, today I'm going to talk about enclosures. I'm trying to draw some historical perspective of the term, its usages, and its ongoing relevance for today. First, let me say a little bit, a few things about myself, apart from the socks. I grew up as an adolescent in an extraordinary time in Italy in the 1970s. We had what was called the Long 68. It started in 68 with the workers' struggles, and then it lasted for at least 10 years longer, with all type of struggles emerging everywhere. When I did high school, just to give you an idea, my first day on high school, very first day on high school, to give you an idea of the atmosphere in which I grew up as an adolescent, as a teenager. The first day on high school, we were taken by those people in the second year, and we were taken into the gym where we trained to sustain police charges. And we were all naive, 14 years old people, and suddenly we were embracing one another in cordon, because that was the atmosphere. We were on a strike every second day, strikes for student matters, for the nearby factories we've been occupied, for the rise of public transport prices, for anything you might imagine. We were on strike, and in those years were excellent, because although we studied little at school, we did study a lot in collectives. My first reading of Marx was not at the university, was in a group of factory workers who were tired of intellectual telling them what to do and what were the revolutionary principles, and they started to study Marx's Capital. And by studying that literature, they were telling their own experiences on the shop floors, which so the tales, the stories that Marx was telling, and their theory kind of reverberates. It became very lively in their stories in the present at the time, in their own struggles as well. So I had the fortune of absorbing all that, and unfortunately, as soon as I become my 18, 19, I start to orient myself in this very diverse movement. I mean, feminist movement was the beginning of a strong environmentalist movement, although tied still to the question of labor and work, which is, I think, is an important connection. When I started to absorb the tools, also the theoretical tools to navigate and orient myself in the world, the party was over. It's like someone just invited me a party and I just started dancing, and someone switched off the music and the lights, and then that's gone. And the 80s began with neoliberalism. And so ever since, I had inside me this desire of these questions of how do we change the world is very rooted in me. And I study economics. I did political sciences, and then I did a PhD in economics, because I thought, well, that is where power is. That's where the main rationality. I need to understand it. And then I became an economist, and I felt claustrophobic inside the paradigm of economics. And so I started to specialize, to go anywhere else I could go to try to find hints of answers, or maybe more difficult questions. And later I discovered that actually, as the Zapatistas remind us, by asking questions, we walk. And so I walk through by asking questions, and wherever I found them, I try to collage them, or like my work is more the work of a bricolaur, trying to get things here and there. So today I want to talk about yes, the enclosures, and I want to start from the very origin of the problematic of what Adam Smith, the father of economics, wrote in 1776 in his book. The same year of the American independence is the year in which Adam Smith publishes his Wealth of Nation, an inquiry into the origin and nature of the wealth of nation, where it essentially set up the Bible. He writes the Bible that justify the fact that self-interest of isolated individuals competing with one another create the common good, which is the commonwealth, the wealth of a nation. His problem, though, I won't go in his theory, of course, but I'll state his problem, though, and I mean, he's working at a moment in which, of course, the Industrial Revolution was kicking off in the south of England, but also in Scotland. A lot of industries were emerging. He writes in a period in which, of course, there was already a lot of accumulated capital. And there were a lot of people willing to work for capital, for the factories. So he was asking himself, but also many other people asked themselves, many other what we might now understand as economists, but people who thought about the economy. Where does this cap? Why do we have people with a lot of capital and people who don't have capital and have to work for those with capital? He asked these very naive questions, which is a very important question. And his answer was straightforward. Well, we had a lot of people with capital because previous generations in their own families have saved a lot. And while all the others have not saved a lot, and so they find themselves with no capital. So that's the saving theory of capital, or original accumulation. Now, Marx completely disintegrates this story with his theory of original or primitive accumulation. This was a term that were used by showing that historically that's not the case. What actually happened in England, in the specific context of England, but actually this happened throughout Europe from the end of the 16th, 17th century onward, what happened was a process of expropriation of the commons. Well, there was also another aspect. This was important, which is, for example, in the case of England, the expropriation of the Catholic Church land by Henry VIII, and the redistribution to various layers of the nobility there, which allowed accumulation of landed capital, which then turned into something else. But also more important is how come that when I asked my student, how come you have an agricultural agrarian society and suddenly people go in mass to work in the factories for a pittance? So actually most of the students say, well, because of high wages, because they want to consume. But well, look, they were paid really little and they were working 14, 16 hours a day. And so the answer was enclosures, the enclosures of the commons, the big enclosure movement, which was pushed by the nobility, that enclosed common land that the peasants were able to maintain and defend throughout centuries. And in fact, the Middle Ages, the late phase of the Middle Ages, and throughout, well, from let's say the 13th centuries to actually the modern era into the 16th century, the peasantry around Europe gained a lot of rights through struggles, through very bloody struggles, a lot of rights to common land that was guaranteed by the nobilities and the king. I mean, if you think about in England, the Charter of the Forest, which was part of the Magna Carta, which is a right was granted precisely after long struggles. So what happens was the expropriation of land, their enclosures, the building up of fences around land, so as the landed gentry could use that land to raise sheep, because there was a high demand of wool in the Flanders in Northern Europe, and that would allow them to slowly turn into entrepreneurs and businessmen, and by kicking out commoners. The commoners, we call the commoners whoever have access to the commons or practice any form of commoning. The commoners were depending on their common land. A part of their livelihood, actually a substantial part of their livelihood, depended on collecting woods, collecting fruits, collecting all sorts of goods that allow their survival beside the little plots that they had to cultivate. Incidentally, the commons, I mean, it actually manifests in different ways in Europe. Max Weber has this description of how, for example, in Central Europe, large stretches of land which were cultivated by individual farmers then cyclically became common land for pasture, and everybody had the right to access that land when the cultivation was not done. So there were many practices of commoning, and the effect of these enclosures were, in fact, a double effect. Marx talk about essentially a double separation, well, actually, Marx mostly emphasized the separation of people from the means of production. What the enclosure do is separating people from the means of production. the 1970s feminists who worked on this, and Silvia Federici's actually work is enlightening on this, emphasize another aspect, and that's why we can talk about double separation, which through the enclosures, what we have is also a mechanism of separating people from one another, destroying communities, destroying social relations, social bonds. And social bonds are necessary not just to allow social reproduction to go on, but also to weaken the struggling power vis-a-vis higher layers of the power hierarchies, and therefore making people accept then their destiny of becoming factory workers, or migrants, or robbers, which are the effects generally of the enclosures. Incidentally, if you think about the effect of the enclosures, which is exactly what I've listed, or struggle, of course, all these effects happened back then in the original land enclosures of the land that Marx is talking about, and it's happening now, something that I will mention later. If you think about the effect of extractivism around the world, of climate change, which is, we might consider, and we'll talk about later a little bit, a form of enclosure. So the reaction of the state there was the bloody legislation, which is again a repression, strong repression against any movement of people, which was not recognized as obvious result of people being dispossessed from the means of production. Then people have to move around, right? And the bloody criminalization of movements, and everybody was channeled really historically to then accept the work discipline in the in emerging factories. So this is the story that Marx is talking about when he's talking about enclosure. The concept of the double separation is very important, because it is something which is at the basis of our problematization of the commons. But at the time, also enclosures, I think, is important to understand the systemic dimension of enclosure. There's something that few people are pointing out, but that few are. For example, if you think about the triangular trade, which was based on the slave trade up to the early 19th centuries, essentially. What you see here is the triangular trade between, let's say, Britain, Africa, and the Americas, and the trade of manufacturing going to Africa to like weapons, etc., and some manufacturing to pay the slave traders. The slaves turn into commodities, and which then had to work on land taken away from indigenous communities there, which then produced goods to feed the Industrial Revolution, right? To feed the rising factories. It's interesting. If you read stories about the Industrial Revolution, it only looks like a big stories of innovations, of technological development, but that's not the case. That's the fact that three types of enclosures in three different points of the globe were systemically linked together. Okay, the enclosures of the peasants in England, the enclosures of the bodies of the peoples in Africa were taken away from their community, and the closure of the lands of indigenous people in the Americas, and they were systemically linked by trade links. Okay, there is also, of course, then the great work, as I mentioned, of Silvia Federici in The Caliban and the Witch, describing how the attack on women during the witch hunt in Europe was systemically linked also to the question of enclosure as a way to weaken communities and making them less to reduce their own powers of defense. Why? Because the women who were considered as witches were actually the healers of the communities, were the nurses, the healers within a community, the people who hold together communities in many aspects of social reproduction. So criminalizations of women in that sense, which emerges at the same time of men's dominated medicines and establishment of a new form of patriarchy. Well, that is crucial also as a moment of enclosures. Now, this is what enclosures are in general. What was very interesting is that the Marxist tradition thought that these enclosures were just happened once at the beginning of capitalism, that enclosures, yes, is necessary in order to have the development of capitalism. The socialists in the Soviet Union had a very analogous concept, and the concept was that of socialist primitive accumulation. And they actually destroyed the communal forms in Russia, the communal forms that farmers had with the mir, which were commons-based form of putting land together and deciding together what to do with it. And they had to destroy that in order to promote their own idea of socialist collectivization. So we have both socialist primitive accumulations and capitalist primitive accumulation. But the idea was that you need to do a primitive accumulation, right, or an original accumulator, and then the system will go on its own. And you can focus now, if you want to transform the world, you just focus on the industrial working class, essentially. That was the idea, right? But actually, if you study history, that's not the case. Capitalism requires an ongoing and cyclical wave of original accumulation for a variety of reasons. First of all, because space had to be, by capital, space had to be colonized by capital. I mean, the history of colonialism, it's a history of primitive accumulation in an incredible variety of forms, brutal forms, but also subtle forms that when I mention this to students, you know, if you didn't inquire behind it, you'll say, well, that's normal. For example, imposing taxes. Imposing taxes on a society that didn't have any use of money. So, for example, the French did in Central Africa, and the British did as well in part of their own empire. You impose a tax in money to a population that doesn't have any money. So and of course, if you don't pay taxes, you are criminalized, brutalized, etc. And so how does it work? I mean, how do you get the money in order to pay the taxes? Well, you allocate part of your field to a cash crop, which is exactly what the imperial power wanted and needed. So they had it was a kind of form of enclosures. Okay, so this plot now has to be produced grain, and the grain is bought by the French authority or the British authorities at a price which allows you just to pay the taxes, because your entire livelihood doesn't depend on it. Okay, so that's another subtle form that historically has developed. But enclosures also happened, and that's an interesting thing, also happened as a result of the reaction this time by capital, by the state, who want to promote this model of their own models of development based on profit seeking, etc., as a reaction to struggles. And that's exactly what happened, I think, in the new wave of enclosures that we associate with the neoliberal era, which started precisely when the light and the music of the party I was mentioning before were switched off from in the late 70s, early 80s. I mean, decades and a half of massive struggles, massive victories in these many senses were achieved. More were desired from the people and the movements were struggling. But what actually happened was a conjunction of events that allow capital and the state to cut back a series of resources that were gained and constituted in a very general sense or could constitute in a very general sense a new resources for the commons. If you think about the use of structural adjustment policies in the global south in the wake of the debt crisis, I mean, the first thing that were cut were, for example, food subsidies. The food subsidies to the poor who were needing them in order to leave that, to leave. And the cut in food subsidies meant an increase in prices, and many people, fell into really dark poverty in that. The wave of privatization. In the global north, of course, the same thing. A lot of cuts on social resources and economic resources were granted. In Britain, you have a history of cut in the welfare state, and now the welfare state in Britain is ridiculous in relation to where I found it even in the early 90s. But you have enclosure again in subtle ways, like urban design. You've seen around the benches designs suddenly in the 90s started to appear. Benches designed in such a way to prevent, that is, to enclose, to prevent people from laying down. People especially sleeping rough. Suddenly benches had the handles from one place to another, so you cannot lay down. Or you had corners, which urban corners, which you could lay down within next to a window, suddenly appearing with spikes, so you cannot lay down. Now, this is a form of separation of people from the means of, in this case, of reproduction. As people of with different power levels of power, etc. So suddenly, with the water privatization, public fountains started to disappear. You cannot have water, get water around, but you have to buy a bottle of water. Okay, every form of commodification here of enclosures was linked to some form, some circuits of commodification. So you could really look around and problematize, has this been enclosed or has this been communalized in a very different realms of life. Right, so extractivism now rampant. I mean, if you do not know, if you already know, there is a fantastic site called EJ Atlas. EJ Atlas, it's a map on the internet, environmental justice atlas, where you could you see dots everywhere in the world, and you click on the dot, and you see accounts of struggles on extractivism, against extractivism, a variety of forms of extractivism, mines, agribusiness, oil, and etc. And each of those dots correspond to a form of enclosures or attempted enclosures. And what you have is, at the same time you have an enclosures, you have a struggle in defense of them, of whatever is whatever was there. So essentially, enclosures are cyclical. They are part of the mechanism of development of capital. Capital need to commodify spheres of life, increasing spheres of life, in order to bring those spheres of life in circuits of production which are capitalist based, under its own rationalities, under its own measure of things, value systems, which reduce everything to profit, and that's the main focus of social cooperation. And so I want to conclude this very broad journey with a question, a big question, and the question is, if the essence of enclosures in different historical moments, in different historical forms, and apply to different entities of our social reproduction, social cooperation, if enclosures is, or original accumulation is, an ongoing process that capital is always seeking to do, and if this is based on the double separation, which I repeat is the separation of human beings vis-a-vis the means of production, and of human beings vis-a-vis each other. Separation means essentially that we do not control them. We do not govern these relations. You know, we depend on, to reproduce our lives, we depend on some form of social cooperation. Capitalist social cooperation is layered in a hierarchies and focused on the main objective, which is accumulation, systemically and individually. Okay, and out of this systemic accumulation, there is the reproduction of that hierarchies of power, of status, of wealth, and at the same time, the destruction of nature. I perhaps forgot to mention that there is another subtle, but still not really subtle if when you think about the effect of it, form of enclosures, which is the externalities that capital creates. The externalities that capital creates. You know, think about capitalist rationality focused on profitability. That means that everything that prevent profitability or would reduce profitability is not his own focus in its own rationality. It's selected out of it. So, for example, if I can produce a product and shift the environmental cost of that product to society, that's more profit for me. The cost is shifted socially. The community being polluted, I'm not paying for the community. I'm not paying for the health, for the effect, the impact that my pollution creates on the community, unless I am made paying for it by struggle, essentially. But if there is a rebellion, if there is a resistance to that. But in the normal course of things, I don't think about it. Why should I? I'm not paid. Doesn't enter into my counting. All right. So polluting a river, well, I don't live down the river there. It's not my business. It's a social cost. It's an environmental cost, which for me doesn't enter into account. My shareholders are happy about that. Okay, that's essentially. It's a form of enclosures. Why? Because it separates us again from the use of that river, from bathing, from fishing in it, from drinking water in it. And the same thing can be said about the atmosphere, about anything. So enclosures really happen in many ways, and it's based on this separation between the means of production and people and the producers and the means of production. I cannot live on that river anymore. I'm separated from it, but also separation from people to one another, because the more enclosures there are, the less we are capable of, the more we are put into the systemic competitive loop with one another, which capitalism is based on, and the less we are keen to cooperate in alternative ways, because we have to run essentially the rat race. So the question is, how do we establish a conjunction? That's, to me, the most important political questions we can ask. If capital is premised on the double separation of people and means of production and people from one another, and by means of production here, I'm also including, I know we should need to do many other differentiation, but also include non-human nature, to the extent that we have to relate to non-human nature in order to reproduce our lives. Okay, to that extent. And of course, non-human nature is also a source of inspiration in many other areas. It's not just a resource, it's not just a means of production, but by maintaining the focus on social cooperation, I think is important, because we have to transform the main form of social cooperation we live in. So the question is then, how do we establish this double conjunction? How do we rejoin? What forms can we find to rejoin people and the means of production, and people with one another? And this is the problematic of the commons. And that became clear. It became clear to me in the very moment when I started to work on enclosures. And it became clear to me that the commons, the problematic of the commons, which is the problematic of reestablishing the meaning of what is a commonwealth for our social reproduction, and reestablishing what is the meaning of our relation to one another. When we do cooperate or establish forms of social cooperation to reproduce our lives, and in that way we also interact with non-human nature. And here in this in the question of the commons, there is a question, and the question of this double reconjunction. There is the question of what measure of things we adopt. The measure of things is a notion I think could be very simply understood. Whatever we do together, whether we produce a loaf of bread or a tractor or a lesson, whatever, whenever we socially cooperate, we establish either by default or through habitus and normalized routines or through reflexive practices, some type of measure of things. What do we produce? When do we produce? Where do we produce? Who reproduce? How we reproduce it? We producing these things, and how much and why? These are the measure of things. This is the range of questions we could ask any action. Okay, and of course, if you ask a foreman or a manager on an assembly line who needs to compete with other multinational companies somewhere else in the world, those questions very simple. We produce this product because there is demand. We produce this way because that saves us cost. You produce it and you get that much paid, and because there is a wage hierarchies, and so on and so forth. So we know how the system answers to those questions. Okay, the system has institutions to answer those questions. But the questions for us is if we want to establish a reconjunction of people with one another and people with the means of production, is for us, those are open questions. And of course, the answers depend, there's no universal answers as there are for economists insofar as reproducing capitalist loops. But for us, these questions are relevant, are value-ridden. There are answers, both the questions and the answers imply some value judgments. And to the extent that the questions and the answers are addressed collectively, implies mechanisms, institutions of deep participatory democracy. And these are, in a sense, the forms of governance that the commons require. So I just want to end with a mention. Amber reminded me about the Commoner. The Commoner is a journal that I established in 2001 on the basis of the reasoning on enclosures, of which I've briefly outlined, but with that idea of promoting the commons as an alternative basis for shaping a new form of social cooperation. And so the Commoner had a life, but in the recent year has been dormant. There have been some technical problems, which we did solve. I'm not going through it. And now the desire really is to relaunch it as also as a collective platform. But what is typical of the Commoner in relation to other journals on the commons, and that is that we, the Commoners doesn't want to romanticize the commons. It doesn't want to romanticize what could be the alternative, but want to locate the construction of the commons, these alternative forms of social cooperation, right inside the belly of the beast. That is, that we live in a world in which there are extremely powerful social forces we call, in a brief synthesis, capital and the state, but essentially powerful social forces which have a project, and the project is not sharing the world where we live in. It's, in fact, as it goes on, is in a sense to destroying it. Although maybe that's not the planned purposes, but is the effect of that rationalities, the capitalist rationalities, has on endless growth based on exploitation and enclosures. So I just end there. I hope, yeah, that's it.